And they look at the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on migration, and they say, well, look, none of these wars are working. But the question is not why they're not working, it's who they are working for. I was an aid worker doing the research, particularly in Afghanistan, where I kind of went to kind of remote villages. And all around you, there were kind of fields of poppies. It was evident that the poppy economy, the opium economy, is central to how people were surviving. But there has been a shift now increasingly to synthetic drugs. And that is going to kind of really transform the drug economies. The war economies and the peace economies are symbiotic related to each other. And so from the perspective of the hub and where, the peace economy, these war zones are less problems to be dealt with than opportunities to be exploited.
The Inspire Us podcast.
So can you kind of explain what it is you study? Because I know you're also leading a CIVAD, which I saw was the Center of Illicit Economies and
Finance and Development.
Yeah.
Should I tell you a quick kind of short backstory about why I'm into these issues? So I, many years ago, like 40 years ago almost, I was an aid worker working in Afghanistan, Pakistan, then in Sri Lanka, and then in Central Asia. And it was through this experience, working with NGOs, but also people who were going through kind of major transitions and trauma and conflict, and that I became interested in these questions about the relationships between violence and illegality and conflict and processes of development. So I ended up doing a PhD and particularly focusing on Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And it was in kind of doing the research, particularly in Afghanistan, where I kind of went to kind of remote villages, particularly in northeastern Afghanistan, asking people about their livelihoods, how they survived during the conflict, getting them to talk about their stories. And all around you, there were kind of fields of poppies, and it was evident that the poppy economy, the opium economy, is central to how people were surviving in this kind of environment on a very remote area of Afghanistan, but poppies were enabling people to survive, to keep a foothold on the land. It was leading to bazaars that were thriving with kind of consumer goods. And so that's really started getting me thinking about illicit economies, how it is linked to conflict and violence, and also thinking about the spatial dimensions, because this was on the edges of the state, supposedly places that were disconnected, that were left behind, and yet you could see in front, in your very eyes that they're highly kind of innovative kind of places where there's rapid changes going on, and people are accumulating in these places that were very, very connected to the global drugs trade. So out of that experience, then I kind of started developing a research agenda around these issues, and eventually, after a lot of trying to build up a proposal, we won a major kind of research bid for what was called Drugs and Disorder. So that was a very big kind of research program working in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Colombia, looking at illicit drug economies. In three countries in which over kind of 90% of the global supply of opiates were produced, and over 50% of the global supply of cocaine, and doing research in 9 different borderland regions, which were kind of key zones of production and trafficking.
You mentioned there was areas of fast change happening in Afghanistan. What is fast change? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the things that our research has been doing is trying to challenge this, what has become a very predominant kind of policy mantra of kind of war being development in reverse. So war is about destruction, and until kind of war ends, then development processes are not happening. That is, and so the work we were doing in Afghanistan shows that wars and war economies are not just about breakdown. They lead to the creation of new forms of order and new forms of accumulation, new kind of elites who kind of accumulate, and new forms of investment. So you can see that in, as I've just mentioned, that in opium growing regions, then in Afghanistan, particularly during the harvest period, you see, in influx of people to be involved in the harvesting. You see the kind of the growth of hotels and tea shops, the construction of infrastructure, the kind of the presence of growing presence of consumer goods. More people own and use motorbikes. So there's things happening in the middle of a war zone linked to criminality, which are in many ways what Diffie would call forms of actually existing development. It's not the nice development we see in the kind of World Bank frameworks of good governance and so on, but it is a form of unplanned, very conflictual, very volatile form of development. Leads to investment and leads to accumulation, and it leads to winners and losers, obviously, in those processes.
Do you think the fact that Afghanistan has this industry facilitated the Taliban to kind of be this new governing order in the country?
I mean, the industry has a long backstory that precedes the Taliban. In lots of respects, the opium economy has been described as a low-risk crop in a high-risk environment. So for years of conflict where it's been difficult to get goods to market, where there have been checkpoints all over the country, where kind of land ownership is contested, and where often the Kerez, the water supply system, the Kerez's irrigation canals that run underground, they haven't been kept in repair. So all these things are mitigated against the illicit agriculture. And Afghanistan historically has relied very much on agriculture as its main kind of backbone of the economy. So poppy has a number of comparative advantages. It requires less irrigation than other crops. It's got a kind of multifunctional role. It's something has long shelf life. It's easily transported and concealed, and so it can go to market. It's got a guaranteed price because it's illegal. It has other roles that it's a source of fuel and can be a source of fodder. And also there's a whole kind of infrastructure developed around the opium economy. So farmers can get access to credit, they can get access to inputs. As I say, they got a guaranteed price. So the traders come to the farm gate. So there's all these sorts of kinds of whole kind of infrastructures developed around it, and it's all linked to the kind of the risk environments in Afghanistan. So if a farmer grows onions, the price is not guaranteed. They often spoil before they get to market. They can't compete with onions grown across the border in Pakistan. So there's all these reasons why opium has become like the backbone of the rural economy, and it's also labor intensive. So it employs a lot of people. So 3 or 4 million people, their household. People that have relied upon this economy. So it's not just about a political regime. This kind of started in the 1980s. It grew in the 1990s, and it's continued to expand until 2022 when the Taliban imposed this ban. And they imposed a ban also in 2000 and 2001.
Wait, they imposed a ban?
Yeah.
On poppy?
That's right, yeah.
Really?
So, I mean, there's a kind of deep irony that for 30 odd years, there's been this Western kind of infrastructure around trying to eradicate opium production in Afghanistan, with billions of dollars thrown at this on the war on drugs, and that's involved attempts to eradicate the poppy, to interdict it as it crosses borders, to create alternative livelihoods, to support the judiciary in bringing to account the traders and the corrupt officials are involved. All of these things have been tried and failed. And then in 2001, the Taliban imposed an opium edict, and they were successful, very brutal, in kind of bringing down production to a very, very low level, almost completely ended. And then there was the invasion by the US in 2001, and there was a huge rebound effect because, the ban meant that prices had gone up tenfold. So there were strong incentives to kind of restart, and then there wasn't the coercive power to prevent farmers from kind of planting their fields. And so there was a huge surge from 2001 onwards, and it kept going up year by year. And when the Taliban took over, they took over in 2021 from the democratically elected government. Soon after, they imposed another ban, and it's been held now for 2 years.
Is this a complete ban? Because this might be misinformation, but what I've heard is that the Taliban have gained control over all poppy fields, and they're sort of the ones running this drug trade. But that's not true.
Well, I think this is contested, all right? So when the Taliban, the first ban came along, it's definitely the case that they stopped cultivation. But there was a lot of storage there was a lot of opium stocks in the country. So the traders did very well. The prices went up, and the traders...
Wait, they even have derivatives on poppy seeds, or...
Well, there's a kind of supply and demand kind of issue. This is one of the perverse effects of kind of either cutting back on production or completely stopping it. Clearly, the price will go up. It's a very sophisticated system that's adapting to changes in supply and so on. So yeah, the supply went up, so traders benefited. People argue a similar thing is happening now, that the people who obviously are suffering the most are the poor farmers who had to stop production, but major traders have benefited as the prices have gone up. There are questions now about how long such a ban can be sustained. I suppose what is the difference between the Taliban and the previous regime is the Taliban have control over the whole of the country, and they have the power to prevent dissent and to intimidate people. But yeah, in the longer term, there are some major structural factors that are in terms of livelihoods, in terms of the effects of climate change and on the environments as well, that are going to make it very hard to sustain that ban unless there's some kind of... Because the other part of this is, although there are major problems with the international community's response, impact and programs in Afghanistan, there was a lot of money coming into that economy, whether through aid programs, whether through military contracts. A lot of it's kind of was led to kind of corruption and supporting patrimonial networks, but there was a lot of money in the country, and so that's not there anymore. So it's a complicated set of kind of calculations about what impact this ban is going to have in the longer term.
So in this complete takeover of opium by the Taliban, surely there were other groups who were dispossessed. Are there rival groups sort of consolidating power and trying to tackle the Taliban to repossess their the poppy trade that they once had? Or does that not really exist? Do the Taliban have complete control?
I mean, this is getting into. I'm not doing current research about the internal dynamics of the Taliban, but most commentators at the moment see the Taliban as having developed a very powerful kind of political coalition that's kind of keeping a lid on society. It's different from the first incarnation of the Taliban in the 1990s in the sense that it has strong kind of surveillance over society. It has a very hierarchical kind of structure, and a lot of the kind of key backers came from the Pashtun areas of the south, who were heavily involved in the drugs trade. So it feels confident enough to kind of to do this. And so at the moment there's no signs of internal kind of fragmentation within the Taliban. It's got some the coercive power, and it's got the support of its foot soldiers. There's a strong kind of, at least a narrative anyway, of religious dimension, that the opium economy is haram. And another dimension to this is that this is something that happens wherever drug economies become long established. It's not only about production, that there's a growing, probably over 3 million Afghans who are now drug users. Wow. So there's a strong kind of concern in Afghan society and in the kind of the religious elite about how, this is undermining Afghan society. In the past, the Afghans would say, well, look, this is going to the West. This is not our problem. That's their problem. It's their demand. But now that kind of calculus is changing. Within the region, within Pakistan and Afghanistan, there's a major issue around drug use as well.
So what do you think is the solution? Because it's clear you outlined that, there are some benefits that happen when, with these drug economies, that they do support jobs and there's some development and it allows money to flow. And, we think of, countries, Afghanistan, but also, I think of like Colombia or Mexico that I think also get a lot of money from, illicit drugs. But at the same time, there are some issues with it. You mentioned that, okay, the population can become drug addicts, and also this aid issue is now becoming a very popular of saying, having this problem is, attracting a lot of money. So maybe keeping the problem is an incentive because, the aid is coming in. So what do you think is the solution to all this? Should we find a way to legalize these illegal economies? What is your take?
Yeah, I think just reinforcing what you were just saying, that, the war on drugs, it's like there's a very interesting paper by David Keane and Ruben Anderson on this called Double Games. And they look at the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on migration, and they say, well, look, none of these wars are working. But the question is not why they're not working, it's who they are working for, who benefits from the pursuit of those wars. And, if you look at historically, the history of the drug economy in Afghanistan, a lot of international and Afghan actors were benefiting from the pursuit of this war. The investment of resources into this, the way that it was followed fault lines in Afghan society, how commanders used it to take out competitors who are involved in the drug economy. The perverse effects it had actually on professionalizing and integrating the drug economy, making it actually stronger in lots of ways, and increasing the risk premium as well. That, the more dangerous it is, the more you need coercive power, the more you need weaponry, the more you need contacts with senior levels of government. And so, but the greater the profits. So, we clearly, the war on drugs has not worked. That's obvious, but it's worked for certain people. And so there are strong incentives in the continuing pursuit of that war. The other thing to say is that we know that supply side approaches never work. So focusing on production without looking at it as a system in which there are markets, and you need to think about it as a system, a bit like migration. If you only focus on stopping people from moving, you don't think about the inequalities within that system that generate often those forms of movement, then you won't address this problem. I mean, what we are writing about in our work is that you have to think of this as a development issue. And if you look at why people get involved in, where this is happening, the 9 different borderlands we were looking at in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Colombia, these are all places in many ways where people are the refugees of development. They've been squeezed out of the illicit economy. In Colombia they can't compete in the coffee economy, or they've been displaced by the oil extraction, or they're in Myanmar they've been displaced by commercial agriculture or by different forms of mining, jade mining, rare earth mining, and so on. So these are people who find that the drug economy provides them with a foothold on the land. It enables them to reproduce themselves. And therefore, there's a need to think about a different form of development that doesn't create these forms of exclusion and marginalization. And there's quite a lot of narratives around drugs which focus on its exceptionalism and on its violence. And it is violent, but so is cattle ranching in Colombia. So is the oil extraction in Colombia. So is jade mining. They're deeply engaged in kind of forms of violence and exclusion. So there's a need to think about the continuities between licit and illicit economies and the forms of violence meted out by kind of licit forms of development. And then that leads to questions around legalization, which you ask, which is, it's a really interesting and really difficult question. It wasn't a primary focus of our research, but we've become increasingly interested in this. And so there have been experiments in legalization of kind of cannabis farming in Africa, and cannabis in western parts of California, the US. And what we have seen, and again, it's not my main area of expertise, but what we've seen in both of these places is forms of corporate capture. So you open up this market of legal crop production. There's examples also of legal production of poppy, where I come from, in the fields of Lincolnshire or Tasmania or India. And in all cases, it's the big companies who kind of monopolize this business. So the small cannabis farmer or the small poppy farmer can't compete with the kind of industrial scale production of these, and they can't meet all the requirements of the licensing schemes that you have to be able to show you can achieve in order to get into this market. So, legalization in many ways is just marginalizes the small farmer. And if there was an experiment in mass legalization in Afghanistan, for example, well, it's a bit of a moot point now because there is no poppy production going on. But if, for example, that had been enacted between the 2001 and 2021, that would have created the same distress that we're seeing now. So the fact that it's illegal creates this guaranteed market, creates this high price. So there's a need to think about what forms of development that you can't find a magic bullet crop like saffron or whatever to replace it. So you need to think about this, as a system as a whole. The final thing is not the final thing, but one other point to be aware of here is there's kind of some major shifts going on in drug markets globally now. So a lot of the focus has been on illicit drug crops that are cultivated, and these crops have important distributional effects. They keep they're labor intensive, and they coca in Colombia. It's been absolutely central to the rural economy there, but there has been a shift now increasingly to synthetic drugs, and that is going to kind of really transform the drug economies. So we can see this in Afghanistan now. We can see this in Mexico. We can see this in Myanmar. The growth of synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, also fentanyl. And that also has the potential to really undermine the kind of the base of rural economies that are relied upon drug crop production.
What sort of spurred this rise in synthetic drugs?
Well, technological change. I mean, it's has been a significant part of it. I mean, I think so. For instance, in Myanmar, and that's not my primary area of expertise, but militias in the borderlands of Myanmar have increasingly got involved in the production of methamphetamine. I think a lot of it was happening across the border in Thailand, and increasingly attempts to regulate it and stop it in Southeast Asia meant it became increasingly concentrated in Myanmar. And so now that's controlled by a number of armed groups, militias, border guard forces, and there's a very guaranteed market across the border in China and also into Australia. In the Middle East, captagon has become a major, another kind of synthetic drug has become a major source of income for armed groups, and it changes the dynamic because drug crops involves many people, and armed groups, in order to regulate those processes, they need to negotiate with communities, and so there's some kind of form of social contract that develops in some shape or form. Whereas with captagon, with methamphetamine, you just need a small laboratory that's mobile, that can move around. You're not dependent on populations, and so it's in some ways it's more predatory, but also more lucrative. So it's kind of reshape kind of the politics of these kinds of marginal spaces.
So do you think that's going to affect the effects of development that illicit economies had, that these benefits that you mentioned employed a lot of people and etc.? Do you think that switch, because I imagine also now that with synthetic drugs, you need some sort of knowledge, you need some sort of equipment, not just your average farmer can just get into this.
Exactly.
So how does this affect development?
I mean, I think it's a really good question, and this is very kind of recent, and but one would hypothesize that the benefits are very, very concentrated. So it leads to kind of wealth accumulation amongst a small group of people. And that will then shape also the kinds of political settlements that emerge in these places, because there's less of a need to negotiate. It's not that these, so the armed groups in Myanmar, it's not that they're completely float above society with no relationships with them. They've been operating in these areas for decades. But it's certainly going to change the dynamics of development and political authority in these areas. I mean, there's another so in Myanmar, there's what is happening in these borderlands is what we talk about as agglomerations of illegality. So there's poppy production continues, there's methamphetamines, and increasingly there's a new phenomenon, well, not so new, last 10 years, of scam centers. So these compounds where people are kind of attracted, often under false pretenses, to come and work in these centres, and then they're responsible for online fraud, targeting initially Chinese markets. So, tackling reaching out. It's very sophisticated development of new technologies around cryptocurrency, blockchain, digital wallets, all this kind of stuff. Attracting people in on either through romance or through offering them kind of deals to new investment opportunities, and then running away with the money. So you've got these different kind of forms of illegality going on, which are kind of layered onto each other, and they kind of also create capital that gets invested in could be invested in other forms of illicit economy, or even into licit economies such as rare earth mining. So yeah, it's linked also to the growth of organized crime in a much more kind of consolidated way in some of these places. Similar things are happening in Mexico as well. So technological change is really kind of driving it. Yeah.
Aren't we sort of seeing this, the rise of these new political settlements as a product of the synthetic drug trade? I'm probably butchering his name, but Bashar al-Assad, wasn't he one of the reasons why, I think, was it the Israeli or Saudi government sort of wanted him gone, was he was a big player in, I think, one of these synthetic drugs as well. And he was sort of bringing it and making it more widespread in the Middle East. And that was a big concern, especially for these very conservative countries. And I guess we're already sort of seeing the start of the political impact these drug trades are having.
Yeah. Now, this is not my regional area of expertise, but there's some really interesting work done on this by Chatham House as part of a big research program called the Accept, this cross-border conflict research program, and that was looking partly at how Assad is kind of developed new alliances with militias. And it's very similar to the deal in Myanmar. So the state builds these coalitions with non-state armed groups, and the deal is that you can have access to, in the case of Middle East, the captagon economy. In the case of Myanmar, heroin or synthetic drugs. And we will allow, there's a modus operandi of allowing kind of mutual kind of, there's a mutual benefit, that it keeps the state going, and at the same time it provides resources for these armed groups to continue to persist. And so you get in a lot of these places, a system of durable disorder and an illegality. In order to keep a regime kind of intact. But yeah, you're right. I think that may have been one of the factors behind why the kind of regional coalitions changed, because there's growing concerns about the captagon economy and its impacts on the population in the region.
Can you explain what is a war economy, and does it have similar kind of unexpected benefits that we talked about with illicit economies?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, a lot of our work in recent years has been trying to unpack and think about how is a war economy different from a peace economy. And so, I mean, a war economy is essentially activities engaged in related to production, distribution, consumption in the context of an armed conflict. And in work I've done previously, I try and unpack it a bit more into thinking about a combat economy. So the resources that are generated in order to pursue the war effort, to buy weaponry, to pay for your fighters and enable people to reproduce themselves. Secondly, a shadow economy, in which war enables forms of activities, unregulated or differently regulated activities, to take place, which are not taxed, and enable people to accumulate and so on. So think about cross-border trade that can happen in places where borders are less controlled and where states are unable to tax these kinds of activities. And then thirdly, what I call the coping economy, people, the majority of the population who are trying to patch together their livelihoods and survive, whether it's an Afghan who has an Afghan man who has one son growing poppy, another son working across the border in Pakistan, one person who was fighting with the government and another is fighting with the Taliban, where you spread risk in order to try and survive. And there is a kind of a big body of work in recent years about how war economies work, particularly in the global south, who they work for, and trying to better understand them. What we've been trying to do in our recent work is the drugs and disorder, we were focusing very much on war economies in these borderland regions. And now what we're trying to do is to track the flows of capital, commodities, and people from these border regions to metropolitan centers, two areas ostensibly at peace. So how is the flow of capital, commodities, and people between Myanmar's borderlands and Kunming in China, a kind of rapidly growing kind of gateway city? Or what are the links between illicit economies in Afghanistan or the Horn of Africa and Dubai? So in this kind of work, we're kind of trying to unpick how war economies and peace economies may be linked to each other. So in the zones of peace in Dubai or in Kunming or in Nairobi, these are places where there's rapid development going on, and yet they're highly linked to unruly kind of war zones. And our hypothesis is that these borderland regions enable forms of activity and accumulation and extraction to then feed the process of growth in these metropolitan centers. So the war economies and the peace economies are symbiotic related to each other. And so from the perspective of the hub, and where the peace economy, these war zones are less problems to be dealt with than opportunities to be exploited. So, for example, in what we're looking at in Myanmar is how rare earth mining extraction in the borderlands of Myanmar is feeding China's green energy transition. We're interested in how the illicit drug economy is creating flows of capital that get invested in Kunming. And we're interested in how scam centers are also leading to processes of accumulation, and that may be funding developments in Kunming. So there's interesting work being done by people like Alex de Waal now, who's talking about global war economies and how these symbiotic relationships develop.
It's interesting, this idea, and then maybe it can go into a philosophical thing. If there's a bad thing happening somewhere that is helping a good thing happening somewhere else, is it justified, and should we keep it going? But I don't have the answer to that. And then also this idea of global war economy is interesting as the globalized world and stuff. And I think maybe we can really see that with Ukraine. I don't know what you think about that, but how this one conflict led to a whole kind of unified, almost effort about this war economy. And also now with every change that happened with Trump, you had the EU that's also said that we're essentially, gonna put a lot more effort into manufacturing weapons and this and that. So what is your take on Ukraine, its war economy, and do you feel like there's a way out? And another point on that, talking about war economies and the messed up incentives that happen, people talk about how, when there's war happen, there's a lot of destruction happen, but after that, people get, big contracts to rebuild the broken country. So a lot of messed up incentives at play, but I guess what is your take on that? Sorry if I put in a lot of things there.
A lot of things, and not all of them I'm qualified to say anything of any authority on. But I think the point about that good things happen in one place and bad things in another. Let's kind of take that a little bit more. And I mean, it's part of a very old kind of story that has been extensively written about the combined and uneven nature of development. And so the kind of this hypothesis we want to explore is that these kind of war economies in the borderlands, the global borderlands, if you like, in the peripheries of states and of the global economy, they're not the result of being disconnected or being left behind. These are places that are highly connected in lots of different ways, and the drug economy is a good example of that. Global migration is another. Organized crime, that's another. The key thing is about, I mean, what David Harvey writes about is challenging this diffusionist narrative that basically, to deal with these disordered faults of progress, just build these connections to extend markets, to extend states. And what our work is arguing that these places are connected, but it's adverse incorporation. They're integrated in terms that work against these areas. So we're trying to kind of purposely place attention and focus on how these integrative processes have these devastating effects, whether it's the extractive kind of processes around rare earth mining, which leaves toxic environments behind, and the major benefits go to China and so on. And so it's trying to think carefully about how the so-called pathologies of the margins, the reasons for those pathologies don't lie there often. They lie, whether it's London, whether it's Nairobi, whether it's Dubai. So that leads to some kind of difficult kinds of questions about, so for example, banking systems and the flows of resources into Dubai, the laundering of money. It leads to questions about how places like Afghanistan have been intervened in and policed and subject to these kinds of policies, whether it's the war on terror, whether it's the war against drugs, how they, so thinking more carefully about distributional effects, not just within these peripheral areas, but at a kind of global level. Going back to this question, I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about Ukraine in any substantive way, but I think there's some interesting work that Alex de Waal has been contributing to, firstly about political marketplaces in the global south, but he's tried to extend that analysis to thinking about war economies at a global level. And his basic argument is that from the kind of the end of towards the end of the Cold War through to about 2010 or so, there was a kind of an American-dominated, Pax Americana kind of global war economy. Huge investment in the industrial military complex, development kind of linked to the dollar, linked also to a whole kind of counterinsurgency doctrine about stabilizing areas and so on. And he's arguing that since 2010 or so, that this has been challenged by the BRICS, by China, and attempts to de-dollarization, and so there's a kind of contestation going on about at a global level around the control of the economy, and a collapse of the kind of the so-called liberal consensus. And I guess these things are playing out in places like Ukraine now, and I mean, there is a kind of evident that's kind of very big kind of picture and probably quite generalized. But I think that when we think about war economies, I think we need to kind of extend it beyond these kinds of areas in the global south that are affected by war. It kind of tracks back to a lot of other processes going on in kind of metropoles.
Mm. I guess working with development agencies, does it ever feel a bit futile, these attempts to sort of counteract the interests of big business or the interests of the metropoles? And like, how do you actually counteract these powerful interest groups? What are the ways?
I mean, this is kind of way beyond my pay grade and way beyond, it's going beyond what our work can do. I mean, I guess what our work is trying to do is, first of all, point attention to this. Which I guess it's in some ways it's hardly novel. And I mean, I'm not talking on behalf of the current government, but I mean, there has been a lot of, for example, a big stream of work in recent years trying to think about the relationship between developments and organized crime. And that's focusing not only on corruption in the so-called developing world, but kleptocracy in London. I mean, this also goes back to Ukraine and the resources that have been kind of funneled through to London because it provides a safe haven for or to buy for illicitly generated economies. I mean, it's clearly it clearly is more challenging because it really pushes against very serious kind of sets of interests and powerful actors. And as I said, our focus has been primarily on the regions in the global south that have been affected by these processes. Although increasingly, that takes us back to thinking about the things that you just raised. And there's a program which FCDO has been funding for some time called SOCE, Serious and Organized Crime, Transnational and Anti-Corruption Evidence Facility, which is kind of looking at these kinds of questions as well. It's you've put your finger on something that's really thorny and difficult. You might want to also speak to colleague Mushtaq Khan, he's dealing with these issues even as we speak, and it's a very good example of how what's been happening in Bangladesh is also linked to what's happening here.
Wow.
And so
complicated.
It needs obviously a kind of transnational kind of lens to be looking at this. And one of the things that we are critical of is of policymakers and the tendency towards what we call methodological nationalism, to see things in nation state terms and not. So if you're looking at organized crime, you're looking at illicit economies, you have to take a transnational, regionalized approach. It makes or migration for that matter. You can't, it's a part of a much bigger ecosystem. So saying, I've got a country budget, I've got a country partner, and I've got a country program, you're only touching a very small part of that ecosystem. So you need to kind of get out of those country boxes, I think.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Any final thoughts you want to say? Where can people find your research?
So if you do a search for drugs and disorder, SARS, that's got all the information about the drugs project I mentioned. And then if you Google CIVAD, CIVAD, that gives you some information about the Centre for Study of Illicit Economies, Violence and Development. But thank you very much for talking.
Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure.